Well, of course, I think the big thing which would change would be that India is in a very different position economically to the position it was before. And India is in a very different position in what I might call moral terms as well. At the end of the 90s, things were looking very bleak in India. We'd had 20 years or more of Neta Babu Raj. The economy was stagnant basically because of that Neta Babu Raj and all the bureaucratic controls that existed, particularly the controls on investment and on doing business. So that would be very different. But one thing I would say which would not be different would be the emphasis on that India must find its own way ahead and not simply ape and follow America or the Western model. What has happened, obviously, is that television has taken off in a big way. And sadly, radio, which is the media I love best and which I think is a very, very important media, has not been allowed to develop properly because the government has restrained control over news and current affairs. Television has, as I said, expanded, and I believe that what is now needed with television is to sort of, in a way, call a halt to the expansion and look at what is going on television and see whether improvements cannot be made in that. I think that maybe he overstated the case, probably he did. But I don't think we should react hysterically as journalists. I think that we should examine ourselves and see what is going wrong, and there are things which are going wrong. The first thing I would say is our failure to stand together to resist the onslaught of commercial pressures, which have turned radio, television and newspapers, and indeed radio, into commercial rather than news organizations. Secondly, I think that we journalists very much need to examine the way that we exercise the editorial function. There isn't, particularly in television, enough editing going on. I'll give you one example, the Bombay attacks. If the editors in the studio had exercised tight control over reporters in the field, then we wouldn't have got into the mess that we did over the Bombay attacks. That's just one example. Time and time again you see examples of shows which drift on, breaking news which drifts on, without any apparent editorial control. And thirdly, what I find whenever I ask anyone in television whether there are reviews of what has gone on the day before or a week before, so that people can learn from their mistakes, so that you can criticize and benefit from that criticism, I'm always told that reviews don't take place. When I worked in BBC World Service Radio, we used to have 2 meetings regularly every day. Part of that meeting was looking forward to the news which we should be covering that day, or expected to have to cover, and part of it was very much a review of what we had done, and a critical review of what we had done the day before. Well, as someone who sometimes comes on to these panels, frankly, I'm amazed that there are so many of them. Because, there is a stage army of people, really, who come on to these panels, and they always get politicians, and the political parties send the same people every time. And I think this is largely an excuse for doing television on the cheap, myself. I personally believe that we should have other ways of presenting the news, discussing the news, than endless panel discussions. And of course, one way which you don't see nearly often enough is through news and current affairs documentaries. Well, I think the British media has changed a great deal in the last decade because, of course, of the media which you are in, the internet and the electronic media. That has had a very considerable effect on newspapers. Newspapers have been the main victims, really. And you've got a situation in London, for instance, where a historic paper like the Evening Standard is now given away free because it couldn't get enough circulation to attract advertising. I think the commercial impact has been there in Britain as well. And the other thing I think change has come over very much, which I think is a pity, is that there is far more of correspondence giving you the news in conversations with presenters rather than properly crafted news stories. And very often television just turns into bad radio. And the other day I saw a comedian do a wonderful imitation of those dreadful interviews where clearly the presenter has warned the correspondent what the question is going to be. So the presenter very earnestly asks him a question like, is the rupee going to fall further? And the correspondent says, yes, you're quite right, that is the big question. That sort of thing, rather than the properly crafted news stories. And also, like in India, because it is so much easier to broadcast from the site, there is too much broadcasting from the site now, and too much repetition. I was watching the night that Gaddafi was killed, and you saw the same pictures going round and round and round. Well, I think the political classes have become more organized. They have these spokesmen now and all that. I think some of them rather like coming on telly. They weren't so interested in coming on the radio. And of course they have a much wider field to play. You know, when I was with the BBC, it was a strange fluke of history, really, because the transistor radio had come in, and so radio listening was very widespread, but all the listeners had, other than foreign stations, to listen to was All India Radio. So lots of them turned to the BBC as an alternative source of news. And we became, in effect, a domestic news broadcaster. So that meant that the politicians were much more concerned about the BBC than I think they are now. Their attention is much more on the local media. I'm not sure that there has been a big change about that, except one thing. I wouldn't say they're in the business of exclusives. They're in the business of something much less worthwhile, which is bites. Time and again, even when I go to a book launch or something like that, quite often young journalists will come up to me and say, can you give me a bite? Well, that didn't used to happen nearly as much. And we used to have many more set-piece interviews. I must, in my time, have done 5 or 6 interviews with prime ministers. With Indira Gandhi. I interviewed Rajiv several times. I interviewed Moraji. I made a whole film about Moraji. Now you don't see those as set-piece interviews. And the big leaders don't seem to have nearly as many set-piece press conferences as they used to.